Good afternoon and welcome to Discuss with Russ. I'm happy to be here today. My name is Russell Rivera, founder and president of Voice Wealth Management. This is our 15th episode and it is a special one. My guest this afternoon is Jason Stein of the New York Mets. And our topic this afternoon is the role of sports in the COVID world. I'd like to welcome all of our viewers on Zoom, Facebook Live, and those who eventually will be watching us on YouTube. For those of you tuning today for the first time, the Discuss with Russ program has focused on helping you get through the COVID crisis and start thinking and planning for what the world might look like as the crisis dissipates. Now that we can leave our homes and see each other face to face again, we want to help you anticipate possible responses in society's behavior so you can be most prepared to succeed. Voice Wealth Management, my firm, primarily works with entrepreneurs, young professionals, and their families to help them get the most out of their money. While I'm a chartered financial analyst and certified financial planner, many also see me as their personal CFO and financial therapist, recognizing the psychological power of money in addition to using short-term and long-term planning to help you get the most out of every dollar you earn and use. Well, now on to the main course. Our guest today, Jason Stein. Jason is an assistant in the professional scouting department of the New York Mets. He transitioned to the baseball industry with the Mets early during the 2019 season after starting his career in the investment banking division at Goldman Sachs. Jason worked in both the consumer retail and healthcare group as an analyst before joining the M&A, mergers and acquisitions group, as an associate. Jason graduated with a degree in economics and history from Amherst College in 2016. While at Amherst, he worked with the Amherst baseball team and coaching staff and wrote an economic history thesis exploring the growth and development of Major League Baseball alongside changes in media technology, from the radio era to the current online streaming landscape. So for some quick housekeeping issues, we do have a Q&A tab that you can use at the bottom of your screen for asking questions. So please use that button to ask questions of Jason and myself. We will be monitoring that and having questions go in as appropriate. Other than that, we're not really going to be using the chat. And of course, we'll get to your questions on a best efforts basis. We know Jason can't quite answer all of your questions that you might like answered today. And with that, Jason, welcome to the program. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Russell. Really appreciate the kind introduction and for having me on today. Really excited to be here. Hope that everyone is doing well and staying safe and healthy during this challenging and unprecedented time.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate that. So following that bio, you came from Goldman and moved to working in scouting and baseball. We know you've loved baseball all the way from your bio as well. So how did that transition happen?
Yeah, so, as you mentioned, I've always been a huge baseball fan. Baseball has really been a huge part of my life for as long as I can remember. I grew up in New England, a huge Red Sox fan, an impressionable youth in the early days of Moneyball. Theo Epstein was the general manager. Became general manager when I was 8 years old, really looked up to and idolized him, really tried to devour as much baseball-related information and statistics as I could. And baseball was truly my first real passion and drove a lot of my other interests, especially in economics, history, journalism, statistics. So really, baseball has been central to my life for a long time and have always wanted to work in baseball. As I got older, the sort of composition of baseball front offices skewed a little bit more towards guys like myself who didn't have a playing background of any sort, and now that's become a reality. So how that happened is I've always wanted to work in baseball and dreamed of working in baseball. As I got to Amherst College, I noticed that the landscape was sort of heavily skewed towards graduating seniors who could be available for the end of the season, September, October, because that's really when it matters the most. And obviously with summers being the only possibility, that wasn't really a viable option. And I've always been passionate about finance and economics and want to kind of develop my skill set further, and have had that opportunity to do that by pursuing investment banking at Goldman, and really had a valuable experience there, met a lot of great people and learned some things that I've been able to translate over to baseball. And, it's been a great privilege to work for the Mets for the past 15 or so months. Has been a really incredible experience. Especially I think back to last year, growing up, the trade deadline, July 31st, has always been my favorite day of the year, just to see all of the transactions. I almost like the off season more than the regular season, just all the trades, the free agent signings, and July 31st is when the most action happens. So being a part of that and being a part of that process was really valuable and rewarding. And, the scouting side especially is not really my true background, but, I've had the opportunity to learn so much from the scouts that I work with and to sort of contribute in other areas to help broaden the department. So it's been a really valuable experience, and I'm excited to get the season going in a few days.
Oh yeah, I think a lot of us are looking forward to some sort of baseball. I know from the kids who, to the extent that they've actually been able to get out and play, whether it's a baseball camp or playing on summer league teams, I know it's an important part of a lot of people's lives, and to be able to get back to it, whether it's playing it or watching it, is going to be important to many, and a big part of it. And we'll get more on that later. So, one thing about, I know my story follows yours a little bit, having had the ability to, me being, some of us are a little older, some of us a little younger in terms of sitting and listening on the transistor radio, whether it's from the Mets side, listening to Bob Murphy and Gary Cohen on the radio for all those years, or Steve Summers at night after everything was all done. So I think we can all identify with that kind of thing. And so you was on the Red Sox side, anything particularly aside from the trade deadline that was meaningful to you as a kid in watching baseball?
Yeah. So, I mentioned I've kind of idolized Theo Epstein from his earliest days as GM. That was just kind of a perfect storm of my age, my interest in baseball, all aligning with him becoming, the youngest general manager in baseball history. But, then the perfect storm really started. The Red Sox had a tremendous amount of success early on, broke the curse in 2004. And just that kind of only fueled my interest further. I distinctly remember 15 or so years ago writing off-season prep lists for trade targets and free agent signings and putting my ideal roster. At that point, payroll wasn't exactly top of mind. So, going after the best players. But, as I got older, really started to understand that, not every team can, one team can't buy or get all the best players, and the acquisition considerations became a lot more sophisticated. But, just starting from that, and winning has been what I'm used to, but it was more just those early days and just reading the newspaper and reading all the blogs, especially with trade chatter and off-season hot stove talk was just really fascinating. And I think I just want to be a part of that ever since. And really the analytic side of the game has just evolved so much from that time. I first went to an analytic conference when I was a rising freshman at Amherst, so the summer of 2012, and it was just a really cool experience. And even since then, that benchmark of 8 years ago, there have been a tremendous amount of developments and advancements. And what I've seen is also a huge growth in the amount of people going, the interest that it gets in the press. It just expanded dramatically since, and it's great to see.
Yeah, you mentioned analytics, and for those of us who are a little older, it's new school, right? It's not the analytics conference you went to is not the SABR conference, Society of American Baseball Research Conference, I went to when I was 10 years old, and Bill James had maybe just finished his first baseball encyclopedia a few years earlier. But analytics at baseball's been at the forefront of it, and it's obviously in a lot of other sports now, but not everybody understands what that means. So could you tell us a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, sure. And you mentioned baseball sort of being at the forefront of the analytical revolution, if you will, within sports, but I think it's worth noting, and I can kind of speak to this a little bit firsthand, is sports, with baseball leading that charge, have kind of in some ways led the big data revolution in many industries. I think people use the word moneyball as a verb. We're going to moneyball this industry, or this industry, is undergoing a moneyball revolution. It's really incredible to see how that term has become such a buzzword. And that all starts with kind of the early 2000s. Once again, right when I was an impressionable youth kind of growing up in this era. But sort of the earliest days of the analytical revolution in baseball center around player personnel driven advancements in analytics. So at that, what has become sort of mainstream today was very advanced, 15, 20 years ago. And that was sort of focusing on different statistics like on base percentage for hitters, and how that was really in some ways almost the same as getting on base via a hit. And that wasn't typically valued in the same way. So the Oakland A's were able to sort of exploit market inefficiencies. But, as has become even more the case, but has always been the case just with baseball and sports, is sports and the teams that play them, are extremely competitive with each other. And that hyper competitive industry really leads to only narrow gaps to exploit market inefficiencies before other teams catch on. But broadly, I mean, what the Moneyball sort of revolution and the resulting diaspora are about is the idea of, you have the use of advanced data and statistics and big data and creative thinking to exploit market inefficiencies. And I think the ways that has evolved over time, are considerable, and I'm happy to kind of go through some of those as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, and part of it, some of that even goes back. I remember maybe the timing's not the same, but I remember when I used to work in the trading world, right? Just trying to get, and you have tons of hedge funds and mutual funds out there that are essentially trying to do the same thing, trying to take all of this data that exists in the market and try to find that little inefficiency. So you could tell us a little bit more about that if you'd like.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, kind of the way that Moneyball became the story and development that it is, and how its first contribution to the baseball and broader sports, and I like to say broader society landscape at this point, was sort of through the player personnel driven statistics, player acquisition driven and analyses on how to field a better team and roster construction. I think the next phase after that was largely centered around in-game strategy. And that's sort of most pronounced in the late 2000s decade and the early 2010s decade, and has really taken off since, the idea of shifting in baseball, So that's really an in-game strategy advancement, and really playing to matchups and tendencies of where certain hitters hit the ball. Lefties obviously are going to have an extra infielder on the right side of the infield. And that at first was very strange to some people to see kind of the second baseman maybe playing in short right field. But that's become commonplace, and you have minor league teams doing it now without even the data behind it to kind of get those reps. So there's it's crazy how, 5-10 years go by and things can change so drastically on that front. But what's worth noting is the reason why the shift, at least for some teams, was even more successful was because teams also parlayed that with sort of an increased emphasis on pitchers utilizing ground, pitches that would induce more ground balls. The Pirates are sort of a notable example of that. They went heavy two-seam fastball and sinker to try to get more ground balls, and used the heavy shift to go along with that, and had tremendous success. And once again, it goes back to hyper-competitive industry. People, in some ways, people try to emulate, and teams try to emulate the success of others. And that's what happened in the earliest days of Moneyball, and has happened since. So that's kind of the second big wave, is the in-game strategy arm. And that's still very important today. It's just harder and harder to find that competitive edge as every team sort of takes that on. And then there's a couple others in recent years, but the shift, there's a lot to talk about there. And it's just interesting.
Well, it's not new.
Yeah,
it's not new. I mean,
anymore.
Well, no, forget not new. It's you've got Lou Boudreau of the Indians shifted Ted Williams, so it's not that new in and of itself. It's just it's commonplace. It's commonplace now, whereas before it hardly happened at all.
Right. That's exactly. Yeah. No, it's certainly commonplace. And what's interesting just to see is teams that were sort of changing the repertoires of their pitchers to kind of go along with the defensive alignment.
Fair enough. Just as a reminder, everyone out there, we're with Jason Stein of the New York Mets. If you do have a question, please use the Q&A tab. We'll try to get to your questions as they come in, or at least as they're appropriate. Jason, one of I guess some of the old school fundamentalists, whatever you want to call them in terms of, or traditionalists, I guess, in terms of baseball and maybe some of the other sports as well, as that have kind of been affected by analytics, have been a little critical from time to time. And one of the things being that turns the games monotonous, there's less art, styles of games are different. So let's take a look at basketball, for example. Whereas the three-pointer might have been rare, now it's like you can dunk or you can shoot a three. The mid-range jumper is kind of gone, and Carmelo Anthony lost his career, right? Or at least a large portion of what he was able to do, because he wasn't a great three-point shooter. He was a good mid-range guy. At the same time, whereas let's say the National League style in the 80s was maybe whitey ball, a lot of speed, a lot of that, the stolen base, Whereas now it's, the old American League style of ball, or at least what was supposed to be in the 80s was, walk, hit, 3-run homer. And now obviously we're seeing new home run numbers everywhere. Or records, I should say, new home run records everywhere, at least from a team perspective. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so just kind of addressing home runs first and then kind of taking a step back with that question. I think, interestingly enough, the home run revolution that we're seeing is at least partially a response to that sort of increased proliferation of ground ball pitchers and the shifts. As it became harder to hit the ball on the ground, it quote unquote pays, and there's higher upside to hitting the ball in the air. So you start to see the natural response to that strategy. It's really a game theory phenomenon happening, obviously between the hitter and pitcher, with every pitch, but also between teams as different strategies sort of evolve. But, ground ball pitchers, the best way to mitigate that is with fly ball hitters in every sense of the word. And so increased fly ball hitters, we're going to have more success. And that's exactly what we saw. There's some sort of poster child of the fly ball swing, launch angle swing change revolution. Guys like Justin Turner, Daniel Murphy, JD Martinez, Jose Batista just made that sort of style of play a lot more prominent and successful. Obviously, home runs have always been a huge part of the game, but to kind of see the systematic way in which certain hitters were really elevating their game, both literally and figuratively, with the way they're hitting the baseball, was sort of noteworthy to see. But so that's just another example of teams are always looking to the next frontier, trying to exploit the next advantage. And I think what we're seeing is going back to how sort of what I alluded to in your first question about just my background and how I got into baseball. The roster, the composition of front offices has changed, but it's also become a little bit more homogenous between teams. Teams are sort of emulating the success of teams that have had success. There's more, presence of analytics. Analytics by no means accounts for everything, and I'm not working in an analytical department, but that's sort of part of the picture for all teams. So it just kind of interesting to see that. But yeah, it's all about the next frontier and teams looking to exploit that advantage, and that has sort of led to home runs. And we're seeing, in-game strategy was kind of that next analytical frontier, but since we've really seen the interaction between like player development, the Moneyball of player development, and how that actually goes back to player acquisition of the first Moneyball era of the early 2000s. There's all sorts of new technologies to, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with StatCast, which is sort of the player tracking technology. It provides, launch angle, speed, sprint speed, time around the bases, all these things. There's and pitch tracking technology has been around for a little bit longer with spin rate, vertical break, horizontal movement, all these things. Teams have now gotten very accustomed to that data and have put it to use, not only to acquire players, right? To use that data as like, oh, we want this guy because of X spin rate or X, launch angle or anything like that, but because they see the data and there's also the chance to realize that they can actually make players better because they're getting the constant feedback with the big data. So really to be using the data for player-driven acquiring and acquisition-related decisions, but also the development of players too. So it's, guys have been induced in the last 5-10 years towards hitting more home runs, and that's what we're seeing. But I think it's important to highlight that baseball, the history of baseball is crucial to its identity. Baseball history is a tremendous part of the whole story of baseball. It's what makes baseball so great in America's pastime. Nostalgia is part of baseball. Sometimes not everyone is so excited to see change. I think, we can point to a few examples even in the past several years where changes appear to be the worst possible change, but then now have become commonplace and people are advocating for use of those kinds of things in game or whatever, different rule changes. And I think MLB and its teams have always been really respectful of the history of baseball and how central that is to its identity. And I imagine that will continue in the future. But as you mentioned, the shift is nothing new, right? Baseball is cyclical. It goes through different eras. I think what we're seeing now, though, is the cyclicality of the different playing eras that we're living through are sort of driven by how rosters are constructed, how games are played on the field, and things like that.
Interesting. Fair enough. I mean, yeah. And again, we're seeing how this is, I want to say, the history is, I think a lot of people are even looking at this season and trying to figure out how does this season play into the history, right? We even talked about it. You see articles about, oh, well, how will this season help or hurt people's Hall of Fame chances?
Yeah.
Or what, how if someone hits 400, what does it mean? If somebody hits 30 home runs, what does it mean? So I think, I think there are a lot of questions, and this season's role in the overall history of baseball and how it's going to affect it for realistically, possibly a whole generation of players. Because if you're starting your career now or you're towards the tail end of your career, it can mean a couple of very different things.
Yeah, and just another point on the history, I mentioned that history and economics were two of my main passions and what I ended up majoring in at Amherst. But I think what my interest in history really stemmed from was kind of being able to make those comparisons growing up. Watching the game of the early 2000s. On display. Obviously, there was a lot of home runs hit then too, in a different era, but just to kind of be able to contextualize what's happening now with what has been the past. So to really understand the significance of any given time frame, the past foundation is really important, and it's always interesting to kind of contextualize what's going on. So yeah, will we see a player hit 400? What will that mean? And obviously how it affects individual players' careers will be interesting to see. But I think every team is obviously focused on just winning the championship, and that'll stand. But there's obviously the individual storylines as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of one more individual storyline relating to baseball, right? Like Burt Blyleven, Hall of Famer, record for number of home runs given up in a season with 50. Last year, Justin Verlander leads the American League in homers given up, and he went to Cy Young Award.
Yeah.
Like he didn't give up anything outside of like a bunch of solo homers. So, obviously all those things kind of play together. So, talking about the upcoming season, the season gets underway tomorrow, at least, in LA and Washington. It's the first of the major American sports to do so. Obviously, you've got the MLS's back tournament. You've had golf going on for several weeks. But this is the first real like team sport that has cultural significance, or major cultural significance, I should say. So what do you think it means to the country and the recovery?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there's a lot to it. But before even kind of addressing the current environment that we're in, and this is something that I've developed a stronger appreciation for, in the last several years, is just the power that sports can have on communities and on cities and on regions, especially where there aren't a ton of teams around. But I think sports really has the power to unite. It has the power to help people sort of overcome adversity and difficult circumstances. Obviously, sports by no means at any given time takes away from the devastation that communities and society may face. But I think what sports can do is kind of bring that sense of normalcy to people following horrific tragedies, terrible events, different economic conditions. So, and it's been that way. I think, and I'm sure you have a lot more vivid memories of this, but 2001, 9/11 was sort of my first year that I can remember baseball. But obviously, I was 7 years old at the time. 9/11 was a very difficult time for so many people, obviously in New York City, but just for the whole country. It really shattered the sense of, I think, freedom and liberty that a lot of people felt. And so sports sort of came back, not right away, but in short order, to kind of help start that healing process along with other industries. But I'd be curious kind of your thoughts on how baseball helped fill the void there, but there's other examples too.
Well, I mein, there's a lot there. Obviously, the Piazza home run on the 21st in the first regular season context back in New York was huge. And not that he needed it, but certainly cemented him as a New York legend. And of course, President Bush coming out and standing on the mound in Yankee Stadium in Game 3 and delivering the strike.
Yeah.
Those two New York baseball moments together as a result of that time were were really big, not just from a kind of national perspective, and potentially even slightly less so. I think Derek Jeter's home run in Game 4 when he got the Mr. November nickname also was a big moment in the recovery in that sense. It was one thing for Bush to stand on the mound, but it was another thing for, just this is a baseball game. It's a great comeback. It's a great story to end it, in some of it. And of course, being having the clock turn over to November was like it's uncharted territory. And I want to know how that guy got the Mr. November sign in the crowd there, or where he had the idea to do that. But, that was particularly unique. So, I mean, from a baseball standpoint, New York in 2001, I think those were all big moments.
Yeah. That's a great point. And then just on 9/11, and then kind of talking about some other sports examples, and then sort of getting to the COVID-19 pandemic that we're currently living through and what that means. Just on the 9/11 point, 9/11/2021, the 20th anniversary of 9/11, there's going to be sort of a commemoration in memorial for 9/11 between the two New York teams at Citi Field, which I think will be something very powerful to see there.
Well, and also, you being a Red Sox guy, you can't forget the 13 season with the Red Sox after the marathon bombing.
Yeah, exactly.
So, the fact that baseball has been there really throughout its history to provide a unification point and a unification point for society with its different moments, I think has been terrific for the game.
Yeah. And one sort of outside of baseball example that really comes to mind for me, it wasn't the same year kind of as that sort of Boston Marathon Red Sox World Series of 2013, but the New Orleans Saints in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, that was sort of a complete devastation for New Orleans and broader Louisiana. And the Saints had a very good team sort of come out in those next few years, and that helped really revitalize the city in a lot of ways, economically, on top of sort of the hope and unity and coming together to root for the hometown team that had sort of come up once games got back. But I think just the idea of some sort of return to normalcy and the regular recurring nature of sports helps people get back. But, to kind of address your question now with that context, I just think that's some of the power that sports provides. There's obviously no denying how serious the circumstances that we're currently living through are. Very challenging for everyone in many ways. There's been a lot of loss, a lot of, in terms of lives, economic loss, all sorts of difficulties. I think, what I've noticed is that sports in general have taken their return very seriously, with health and safety as the utmost priority. And I think that's very clear to me, especially with Major League Baseball. The health and safety of fans, players, people working in the game is really what is driving any sort of return plan. And there was a lot of deliberation about the right way to return, and the health and safety protocols were sort of the key focus there. And since we've actually seen some positive testing results among sort of players, I think last week it was reported that 10,000 tests had come back for the previous week. That's basically like on average of 50 to 100 personnel per team per day. And, a small number, like less than 0.2%, came back positive. So I think that that's an encouraging sign. I think the interesting thing is that there's sort of a lot of pent up demand for live sports. There just has been a shortage of live sports on television. And, I wrote a thesis on the sort of economic history of baseball alongside media technology, and just to kind of, I can only imagine what the ratings are going to be. I mean, we've seen it with events so far, the sort of the match 2.0 in golf with Tiger Woods, Phil Mickelson, Tom Brady, Peyton Manning had sort of record ratings for any event on cable TV of its kind. We've seen the NFL and MLB draft experience some pretty high ratings. Some of the spring training 2.0 or summer camp games that we've had recently, have been pretty noticeable success stories from a ratings perspective. I think the Saturday game between the Mets and the Yankees was the most watched of television event in New York on that particular night. So there's that notability as well.
I turned
But
it on
I
at
think,
6:30 for
yeah,
pregame.
yeah. The pregame show is getting a lot more views and everything, and postgame, I'm sure. But I think it's the idea, especially baseball, but all sports, as we mentioned, they're the power to unite and to help bring people together and to help people overcome adversity and challenges. It's by no means to take the place or to have people forget about what's going on, but it's kind of a temporary solace and source of comfort. And I think what I've liked about baseball growing up is the daily nature of it. It happens every day. There's sort of, if you have a devastating loss in the game, like, where you're ahead and then the bullpen kind of blows it, there's always a next day, or there's, the bat just goes silent and there's a shutout. There will be another day. And I think that kind of mentality has been helpful for me to kind of live by in many ways. Sometimes there are tough days at the office, especially when as I go and just, the next day, there's always the chance for it to be better. So I think that is something with baseball, right? It just, the daily recurring nature of it, there will be that pent up demand. And I think it's just interesting too that, this is a current snapshot of where we are in sort of moving past the pandemic. We're by no means through it. And I think that even the way that we're getting back to playing is a reflection of that, right? We are getting back to playing, but in a way that we never have before in some ways, from a health and safety perspective, with how players are being screened, to the fact that really fans won't be in attendance at all. This is just to show, yes, there's some sort of attempt to return to normal, but we are not living in a normal time. And I think what's also valuable is sports sort of has a big stage and a platform. This will kind of be a way, given how seriously the leagues and the individual teams are taking it, to mirror sort of health and safety protocols and best practices that hopefully sort of everyone can follow across the country.
Cool. And obviously with fans determining it for health reasons, it's the authorities, obviously, not obviously major league teams would love to have the fans in parks, but it's just not happening. What do you think the change in experience will be like for you doing your job, for the players, in terms of playing in the games, whether it be, you mentioned some of the protocols that might be happening pre-game or during the game, and even the fans watching at home?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And I think different parts to that too. You mentioned scouting, and I can kind of address that, I think, after, because and how my role is changes is a little bit different than kind of the scouts that I work with. But as far as sort of the fan and player experience, what's interesting is there's that feedback loop between, the fans watching in the stadium and how that impacts the players, right? So with it, fans cheering or booing really has been how major league players have gotten to where they are, right? Obviously they're used to practicing behind closed doors, but they've never really had to play in such a time of heightened competition of a regular season major league game, which we're about to, encounter for the first time tomorrow in front of no fans. There's been maybe one or two. I can think of Baltimore several years ago, which had that, but this is for all teams and all players, really unprecedented territory in that regard. So how sort of the players respond is an open question, right? But I think before we even get into the players, the fan, it's interesting. Like, even just watching on TV, I think is a new experience, especially seeing long home runs hit into an empty crowd, empty bleachers. It's just a weird sort of visual experience and unusual for people. I think there's a sort of an archive and library of memories, visual memories, that builds up for people when they see baseball. So it's in some ways the game that they've always known, but there's going to be sort of different visual experiences this year, sort of watching the game with different backdrops and different optics. And I think obviously the sound too, right? There's all sorts of ways to kind of get crowd noise into the stadium, but the organic crowd noise and the cheering of a big moment adds to the whole experience. There have been a lot of measures that teams in the league have taken to try to engage fans more with this. There's a cheer at the ballpark option, I believe, on the MLB at Bat app, which is sort of just in its first week, and it'll be interesting to see how that rolls out. I'm excited to kind of see what the result there is. And I know there's sort of cardboard cutouts that a lot of teams are using. So teams are being really creative and innovative in their sort of ways to attract and appeal to fans and engage fans in sort of a more challenging environment in that regard. And I think it's been amazing so far. Major League Baseball has really done a terrific job, given a harder deck of cards for sure, and how to handle this situation. For the players, you mentioned it's the pregame protocols, health and safety, that's certainly adding to their focus. There's no fist bumps, there's no spitting, things that are central to baseball players. They have to now be mindful of. The way travel will be is there's some stricter regulations there. And all these things are good, good to help preserve the health and safety of players in what is a difficult environment. But I think even just how players respond to the lack of sort of organic and natural crowd noise will be interesting to see. And there's a lot of sort of questions of how different players will respond.
Fair enough. And just so you know, we have a Q&A tab. If you'd like to ask a question, we do have one question from the audience, and I'm not sure whether to ask it now or ask it later, but we talk about health and safety and everything going on, and you see football conferences and college conferences, curtailing what they're saying they're going to do. Are we going to finish the season? Or how likely do you think it is we're going to finish the season?
Yeah, so that's
a
great question and a tough question to answer. I mean, I would think that given the recent trends that we're seeing as far as testing for baseball, that things bode well there. It's I think one thing, and this kind of relates to the third bucket of people of the question that you just asked, is how sort of how COVID-19 and no fans, no people sort of at the games has affected the scouting universe and the scouting job. I think what our organization has done, and I'm sure others are doing as well, is sort of account for all sorts of possibilities. So that's what Major League Baseball has had to do as far as scheduling logistics. And, we even had the Toronto Blue Jays sort of development of the last several days be something that a lot of people were talking about with the inability to kind of play in Toronto and where sort of they would be playing 2020 home games. There's just a lot of different contingencies that need to be in place. And I have no doubt that all those contingencies are being worked on, both at the league level and at the team level, to ensure that, we're remaining as safe and healthy as we can given the circumstances, and to see that play out, once again, will be interesting, but definitely remain optimistic. But yeah.
So, go ahead. Continue.
Yeah, just sort of on the scouting side, because I think that's another interesting area of how sort of the pandemic has impacted the sport. So fans aren't really allowed in attendance, but scouts too are being either heavily or entirely restricted from going to games, just to kind of limit the amount of people in the stands. So I kind of work on the administrative side of the scouting department, but I'm in daily contact and communication with our scouts, helping to outline our coverage and then helping to aggregate the sort of the scouting information that we receive and help deliver it to sort of our front office leadership. But I think, scouts, just like I mentioned, sort of fans have that visual experience of watching the game with fans in the stands, and the crowd noise is there, and even the smells of food and drinks in the stands. But I think that scouts are very used to watching the game from a certain angle, right? They're used to watching it from behind home plate and being able to go to the first base side, third base side to sort of get different looks. Watching, but sort of behind the pitcher, which is really the TV broadcast view, is going to be the way that scouts are doing their jobs primarily this year. So it's going to lead to some new challenges and different opportunities and experiences for our scouts. I think we've handled it tremendously well in sort of preparing. Everyone has kind of done a lot more video evaluations in the time that we've had with no games in the past few months. And I think we're all excited to sort of tackle a new challenge together, knowing that there will be some things to figure out along the way. But that's kind of the new normal that we're living through, is just trying to figure out and adjust and grow in the process.
So, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of your stuff had to do with scouting on the minor league side as well. That's not happening this year. How does that change what you're involved in this year?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So just to kind of give context, up 3/4 to upwards of 3/4 of like our traditional scouting coverage universe is minor leagues, at least of affiliated ball, which is like the major leagues and the minor leagues. There's other leagues which I can actually touch on in a minute. But so yeah, without minor league play, the focus is squarely on the major leagues. And, as just mentioned, that's only a small share of the overall league. But I think one thing that's really important to highlight is we're looking at a compressed season of 60 games, right? So there's a lot versus 162 typically. And so it's 60 games happening in 2+ months versus 162 and closer to 6 months. So it's definitely a compressed schedule. Talked about sort of my interest in the trade deadline as a fan growing up. That's a key date on the pro scouting calendar. That's not happening July 31st this year, which would be just a week plus into the season, but August 31st. That's only 35 days or so, 35, 40 days into the actual season. By the time the trade deadline usually comes around, it's usually there's more stratification in how teams are playing. You have clear buyers and sellers. There's ways to kind of adjust coverage as you get closer. We're going to have to be accounting for all sorts of possibilities and scenarios in a very small amount of time, and to kind of be sending guys to different places based on how it all shakes up, what our potential needs are, what's the market looks like. Just on the trade deadline alone, as mentioned, shorter season, every game takes on heightened importance. There's going to be ways that the pro scouting department can kind of help the day-to-day major league sort of operation as well, whether it be on the advanced scouting side or other areas. And I think just what's important to highlight is baseball, to get back this season, has had to make some rule changes and adjustments. There's some roster construction-based rules that will be different this year. The roster size to start the season is going to be 30. Everyone talked about the 25-man roster for all these years. It was supposed to be 26 to start this year, and now we're starting with 30 before 26 officially ever become an entity for opening day, right? Because the opening day rosters don't have to be set until really the day of the start of the season. So everyone was talking about who's going to be on the 26, who's going to be on the 26. It was the 40-man all year. People were putting together their projected 26, and now we go 30 for the first 2 weeks, 28 for the second 2 weeks, and then kind of for late August onwards, it's going to be 26 through the rest of the season. There's no 40-man rosters that people have become accustomed to in September. The expanded rosters are not happening this year, and that'll continue into the playoffs. But there's all these sort of new things to be focused on as far as rules. And another area that is going to be a focus and has been a focus for us is sort of other professional leagues that are not part of the affiliated baseball universe. And so what that means domestically, at least, is independent baseball. And independent baseball, for local fans, Long Island Ducks is a team that comes to mind, of the Atlantic League. There's all sorts of leagues, on the East Coast, Midwest, South, the West Coast, all sorts of independent leagues that are in different stages right now, given the health situations and environments of those given regions. But independent leagues, some really good players can come from there. And we've signed a few last year. Some guys end up making it to the major leagues, even in the year that they're signed out of independent baseball a lot of times. So that's an area of focus. And then on the international pro side is another area where we're monitoring closely, the KBO, Korea, Japan, the NPB, and then the first league to come back, the first sort of live baseball to come back was actually in Taiwan. The Chinese Professional Baseball League started in early April and actually has been an important blueprint for, I think, all the global baseball environment to follow in how to get back. They started with no fans, and they've been able to increase to have some fans in the stadium. So there's been other leagues that we paid attention to from sort of the start, and good players once again come out of those leagues every year. Both international players sort of born in East Asia, but also former major league or affiliated professional players who try to sort of resurrect their career over there and then come back and maybe sign for more money than they would have otherwise ever have. And Josh Lindblom, for example, of the Brewers, a starting pitcher, signed a 3-year deal after coming from Korea last year and had tremendous success there.
And if it's not true, if you want to see professional baseball, or at least people getting paid to play the game and go actually see it in fans, you can go to the American Association in North Dakota and South Dakota. Yeah. Apparently they're allowing fans in, even with some of their relocated teams. Yeah. So my wife and I were sharing that yesterday, talking about that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, just even on the American Association alone, it's worth noting now that you bring it up, is that league typically has 12 teams and has really gone to an abbreviated 6 teams at 3 sort of central hubs where the teams will just play each other. So even a league like that is making adjustments to try to accommodate the environment that we're living in, but to also to sort of get live baseball back.
And you mentioned the Ducks. I mean, the Atlantic League is not playing this season. So, to see, leagues make adjustments or just forego their season as the minors have done is not surprising, given what's going on. Another question from the audience, if you can do it.
Yeah, sure.
With the absence of the sport and potential supervised training of players during the lockdown, do you foresee more physical injuries to players this season?
That's a great question. And actually, sort of injury prevention was an area that I had meant to address when you asked your question about sort of the analytical revolution. Sort of injury prevention and focus on injuries has become an increased focus for all teams, I think, over the past 10, 15 years. Baseball players are really valuable and expensive assets. And the way to get the most value out of those assets is to keep them healthy. Some injuries just happen naturally. What is to come will be certainly interesting. I think part of the expanded rosters that we've seen to start the year of 30 is at least to some degree to sort of prevent injuries from happening with a smaller pitching staff, right? A 26 man roster to start the season, that would typically be 12 to 13 pitchers with really a 13 pitcher limit. The pitcher limit has actually been taken off to start this year. So a team could, in theory, go with, high teens pitchers if they wanted with no pitcher limit, which will be interesting to see. But hopefully, those roster construction rule changes will help prevent further injuries. I think people will, be very cognizant and try to be careful or on the side of caution if any sort of indication of a potential injury comes up. But I think the challenge is we're also in a shortened season, so players are going to want to give it their all. So it's going to be a tough balance there, but something that I think, along with the health and safety of the sort of the COVID health of players and fans and staff members, the actual physical health of players will remain a central focus as well. So that's a great question. And I'm sure that teams are doing their own homework on the injury prevention side, as they have done, as sort of among the next analytical frontiers that we're living through.
Now, I don't know if you could speak to this, but is there a specific injury prevention program that gets you don't have knowledge of?
Yeah,
I don't know if you heard the question. Go ahead.
I think I can sort of speak to it more broadly, just from my studies before even entering the game, is just that teams are really developing all sorts of development and health-related plans for their players, throughout the organization. In many of the analytical conferences I've had attended while I was still in college, and even when I was at Goldman, and some of the people I had spoken to in the game, because I was for many years eager to get into the game, so learned from a lot of different people working in the game. Some, I was lucky enough to meet some Amherst alums who are in the game and learn from them, among many others. But just I think on that point, that is sort of part of the plan for a lot of teams, is at least of what I've heard, not speaking to the Mets specifically, but sort of player development specific plans for the given skills of that player, for the given career trajectory, situation, repertoire, abilities of that player, and also taking into account sort of their physical health. So that's kind of the blanket, I think, approach that teams have taken, with sort of health and injury prevention very core to that.
So you actually mentioned player development there, and this might be my last question. One of the things about player development is there's no minor league system. So
Right.
How do players that would have, under normal circumstances, had 500 at bats or 400 bats or whatever it is, at, let's say, the single A or double A level, and aren't able to make the player pool, what are they doing? What can they do to continue their development to hopefully make a big league roster someday?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and you mentioned the player pool, just to kind of elaborate on that for a little, because it's a related piece. So there's sort of the 30-man active roster to start the year, but there's like a universe of 60 players called the 60-man player pool that a team can possibly draw upon to play. And there's sort of, with the major league location, there's also an alternate spring training site for every team where sort of those players that don't make the active roster will go. But of course, organizations have closer to 150, 200 players from the major leagues all the way on down to the Dominican Summer League. So there's really a lot of different levels of minor league baseball that are players aren't getting those game reps to develop. I think that what that means is that there's a lot of intra competition rather than like teams playing each other. That's going to happen, and there's a lot of different measures in place sort of at the team level and only at the individual team level to kind of enhance the development of players. I think what will also be interesting to see is what players who are sort of big time prospects maybe get a taste of the major leagues or sort of the player pool universe of the alternate spring training site just to kind of enhance their development. So I think you're seeing that in a few areas. Some really valuable players to the future plans of teams aren't getting their typical minor league at bats or their innings and are sort of getting to face major league hitters as pitchers, or, some young hitters who have really promising futures getting the chance to face some of the best pitchers in the game. That has to be really valuable experience for players to get. And there's obviously one of the unique things about baseball is, batting average to be successful, only really 3 times out of 10 are you achieving success. What ultimately, and this is something sort of to the mental side of the game, the makeup of players and how players handle struggle and failure is sort of an important part of scouting. Actually, it's one thing to sort of scout sort of the physical tools and abilities of players, but the makeup, how players are as teammates, sort of how they deal with failure, like their willingness to make adjustments, all these things, part of the makeup equation is sort of key to that as well. So players who are young, were at the top of the draft or signed some of the biggest international signing bonuses, or guys who are now sort of have that top prospect label, they might be sort of rushed to a level of like facing major league hitters in this unique time that we're living in. But, even if they are not experiencing the results that they're accustomed to, all players experience some sort of learning curve and time of failure, and to kind of benefit from those failures earlier on could actually lead to accelerated development. There is the risk of stunting players, if they're exposed to too many challenges too early. But I think that that's something that will be an interesting storyline to follow throughout baseball as well.
So another audience question that, we talked about rule changes before. We didn't really touch on any of them. The universal DH in the National League, what effect can it have on National League teams? Yeah,
so it's a great question. It also relates back to what we were talking about on the injury prevention side. I mean, that sort of rule was largely to some degree put in place to kind of protect the health of pitchers, right? It exposes them to less injury risk when already pitching and recovery time is going to be difficult given the stop and go of that was the season so far with spring training 1.0, obviously the few months of not playing, and now us ramping back up with summer camp and the start of the regular season. So that's just something worth mentioning before getting to your question. But it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think the National League, the pitcher hitting and double switching has been a key part of the National League identity. But as we talked about earlier, there's always changes happening, and it's kind of interesting to contextualize changes in the game with what's been done in the past. So, I mean, teams that have more hitters will be happy to have this. I think we'll see how it all plays out. But what's really unique about this season is that teams are really only playing along geographical regions this year. So the East teams are playing the National League. So the National League East teams, with the Mets among them, are playing the National League East first and foremost, but also all of the teams in the American League East, so on and so forth for the Central and West. So the Mets won't play anyone out of the Eastern divisions, and that means playing in a 60-game season at least a large share of those games against, American League teams that have had the DH. So kind of standardizing those rules ahead of the season, I think, is valuable too, given the geographic alignment. But I mean, there's other rules. It'll be interesting to see, the new extra inning rule. There's a lot to be excited about and look forward to going into the season.
Great. I want to thank everybody for their questions. And Jason, I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's been a lot of fun for me. We always have a lot of fun talking baseball, whether within your job or just outside baseball in the world at large. So thanks again for joining us this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Russell. Really enjoyed speaking with you, and really appreciate you thinking of me and inviting me on to be here this afternoon. And hope that we can get a chance to see each other at a game at Citi Field in the not too distant future. But
Well, it looks like it'll be 2021 at the minimum.
Yeah.
But aside from that, I know I usually ask people how they can contact you. So I will certainly leave that to you, how you want to do that, and go from there.
Yeah, sure. So I think, to the extent, any of your clients or friends are interested in asking questions, happy to sort of field questions through you if that's easier. But also, if anyone wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, happy to do that and to kind of go from there as a first step. And if there's anyone interested in sort of ever pursuing a career in the baseball industry or sports, happy to chat about that. I know I wouldn't be where I was if not for many people who I benefited from learning from, their advice and experiences, some of which actually told me to pursue something outside of baseball before entering the industry. So happy to always chat about the broader landscape, and excited to get the season going. It's going to be a busy 2+ months and hopefully longer, and looking forward to seeing how it goes, but really hope that, everyone stays healthy and safe during this time, and really appreciate you having me on.
And Jason, working from home, thank you for joining us today on Discuss with Russ. Again, if you do want to reach me or send maybe questions for Jason, as per his instructions, you can reach me at Russell, RUSSELL, Rivera, RIVERA, @voicewealth.com, or give me a call at 646-630-0980. Again, that's russell.rivera @voicewealth.com, or you can call at 646-630-0980. For those of you watching today, we will be sending a follow-up email if you registered with the link to the recording at voicewealth.com/blog. This will also be available on our Facebook page at facebook.com/voicewealth. And all of our videos are available on the Voice Wealth Management YouTube channel as well. It does take us about a week to get that video up on all of those platforms. Next week on July 29th, we will have psychotherapist Justin Leoy on to discuss how kids and families are dealing with the challenges of living in a COVID world. August 5th, we'll have Anthony Verna join us to discuss patent law, intellectual property, and the opportunities for starting your own business, even in a time of crisis. If you'd like to register for any of those webinars, reach out to me again at russell.rivera @voicewealth.com, or check your email inboxes for registration emails. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.